Hello, my name is Kaitlin Wilfing, the exhibition manager at the Foundry Art Centre, and I am here today with Eric T. Kunsman, a photographer and book artist based out of Rochester, New York. He is putting on his exhibition, Thou Art Will Give, at the Foundry Art Centre in the Ameristar Gallery as a part of the Emerging Artists exhibitions. He works at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He holds an MFA in book arts and printmaking from the University of Arts in Philadelphia and holds an MS in electronic publishing and graphic arts media. As a top 10 photographer to watch in 2018 by BW Gallerists, Eric was named Best Black and White Photographer of the Year in 2019 by Doho Magazine and was the winner of the Gold Award for the Open Series of the Association of Photography UK in 2019. He currently owns and runs a fine art digital printing studio called Booksmart Studio, where he collaborates with book artists and photographers from all over the States. Eric's work has been exhibited in 150 international group exhibitions and 35 solo exhibitions in the last 4 years. His work has been featured in magazines and online articles such as Lens Work, Doho, Black and White Photography, Analog Forever magazine, Catalyst Interview, Texas Photo Society, and many more, and is currently represented in galleries in Los Angeles, California, and Malgame in San Daniele del Frutti in Italy. Thou Art Will Give is an atmospheric photographic experience of the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, as it stands today with the ghostly reminders of its inhabitants. Sprinkled in between images of stark light creeping through windows and hallways are photographs of the warden's logbooks that give a historical sense of life as it was when a penitentiary was still running. Eric wrote in his statement, "I am hoping that through these images and texts, visitors can share some of the sense of loneliness, hopelessness, and desperate search for redemption that drove so many of those spirits to be still trapped within the walls of Eastern State." So, Eric, welcome. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on and do an interview with me.
Well, thank you for having me and looking forward to this.
Yeah. So if we just want to start off with the basics, how did you get into photography and art, and why specifically did photography and bookmaking attract you so much?
So really growing up, it really goes back to my childhood. I was always interested in the arts, more fine art than anything else. But growing up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I had kind of two choices. Well, really, it was supposed to be one choice, which was to become a roofer like the rest of my family. And a lot of the family had also been employed in the steel mills of Bethlehem. And when I was in high school, what was happening is the steel mills were closing. And a lot of photographers were descending on Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And my senior year of high school, I took a photo class. And like a lot of photographers, they say they were hooked and that was it. But for me, it was really about the idea that it really combined my two favorite subjects all throughout school were history and arts. And I felt photography really allowed me to capture the idea of history with a frozen moment. And as Bethlehem Steel was dying and all these photographers were descending on Bethlehem, my high school teacher showed Walker Evans' work. And so here's somebody that's infamous in the history of photography. I'd visited the hometown and took one certain image. And that was really what started it for me. And when I was going through my undergrad degree, I was introduced to the idea of book. And again, that idea of history coming back, but now I'm able to tell a story. Utilizing the turning of the pages, deciding the sequencing, what the story is. And that's where really the combination of photography and book arts has come into play for me. And that's where really the MFA in book arts and printmaking was to make sure I could do that properly and have all the skills, especially the aesthetics with book arts. So
yeah, book arts can really get very fine detail. And I know photography can as well, especially when you can't mess up a film photograph. So is that then why you, in almost all of your work, not specifically in this exhibition, you're very interested in the death of the steel industry and in the American landscape? I know specifically you've done a lot on Rust Belt cities. Would you like to talk more about that?
it's also part of where I live as well. I've traveled throughout the Southwest. I've created some landscape photography there, but because I'm not invested in that area as much, it's more of your touristy landscape, I would say, than anything else. Whereas where I live now, I have a series on Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, obviously growing up there. It really does shape who you are when you grow up in a blue collar town like that. And I go home now and I joke around that New Jersey has invaded it. There's a casino, there's all these different pieces. There's too many people.
Mhm.
But with that, seeing how that has moved on, but now I live in Rochester, New York. So I left Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I went to school in New Jersey for 2 years and then came up to Rochester in 1995 or 1996. And I went back to New Jersey for 3 years to run the photo program, which is where this series came from. But other than that, I've pretty much have lived in Rochester, New York. And the idea of, I feel like wherever I move, I kill industry. Because growing up, I watched Bethlehem Steel Die. I moved to Rochester. I'm watching Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb. All
Mhm.
the major industries in this area are dying, and that's why we have we have a high level of poverty in Rochester. And being around that, being a part of the community, it really reflects my work. And that's where I'm not a conceptual photographer where I think of an idea and then I try to go out and create it. I'm more of a reactionary photographer. So
Yeah.
whatever's going on in life, that affects the series that I'm creating typically.
Would you then consider yourself a documentary kind of photographer?
Absolutely. More of a, and it's even started to become a little bit more defined as more of a socioeconomic documentary photographer, because my last two series have been pretty much about the economics. And my latest one, which is all about the payphones of Rochester, New York, because we have so many of them.
Mhm.
We have over 1,400 still in Rochester. It's really about the economics of race, class, and even technology. So I never planned on this. Again, that could change in the next series, because this series only started when I moved into the facility that's behind me, my new studio, which is in a scary part of Rochester.
Yeah. So then do you feel like you said that everywhere you go, you find that something's slowly dying there? Is that where you feel like no matter what specific project you're working on, you have an interest in like the idea of abandonment and isolation and possible redemption through the grit?
I believe so, because I don't know why, but I've always felt like kind of an outcast in many ways. So I think I can identify with that because of the abandonment, and that's maybe why I see it more and what's happening to other people that are forgotten about. And I think that's where that really comes into play. I have no idea why. My wife and I always joke about like, what about us sometimes with certain things in life. So again, life coming into the idea of the art, that's where that sense of abandonment I think really comes into play. And it's not where it's ruin or just decaying. It's more or less what's the idea behind it as well.
Right. Well, and it seems as though you follow a lot of footprints. You follow the footprints of, people that used to be there. A lot of the work focuses on, this exhibition focuses a lot on living spaces like the cafeterias and bedrooms and things like that. Some of your other work focuses a lot on, um, on other places where it's very obvious that it was a house at one point in time. It's very obvious that there was machinery that had to be used here by a person at one time. Do you find that the space itself informs so much more than just like how much research do you do on the backbone of the actual photographing, or do you just go there to record the spaces that you see?
So for Eastern State series or my newer work or
Any of it, all of it.
okay. So the Eastern State work was really a reflection off of the warden's logbooks for me. And we'll talk, I'm sure, much more about where that came from. But like my recent work, it's about research. There's a lot of research. We'll talk about the payphone since we'll talk a lot more about Eastern State. But the payphone work, it's very much about research and also a lot about collaboration, because there's a lot of people that are studying the socioeconomics of Rochester and throughout the Rust Belt, basically visual documentary or visual sociology as well. And the reason is I was lucky enough to get the list of where they're all located. The Frontier Communications sponsored the work by giving me the list of how many there are. That's why I know exactly how many there are. I do find some that aren't on their list every once in a while, but that's only one aspect of the research. And part of that particular series, and for me, the only way to say is I'm a white guy. And a lot of who's being affected in Rochester is not all white guys. My neighborhood where I'm at is Puerto Rican, Black, every ethnicity is here.
Right.
So that's why I also don't photograph people in there, because I don't want people being labeled as to, oh, this is who's relying on the payphone. So that's why I'm working with sociologists for mapping the census information. And that's where I try to pull more of that data out. but then I also need to worry about the voice of who's telling the story. So for that particular series, which will be at SEPA Gallery in Buffalo in April, which is kind of my deadline for myself to have this last part, which is I'm recording the interviews with the individuals that still rely on the payphones. And I've been buying payphones to then install those in the gallery. And the reason why I want to install those in galleries, you can pick it up and you can hear their story rather than me talking. So also not only the research, but the sensibility of who's telling the story at times is another thing that I'm worrying about. With this particular series, it's really, the research was the reflection, understanding the history of Eastern State Penitentiary. That's where that history part comes back in, but then reflecting off of these log books, which is where the voice came from for
Right.
me.
And why do you feel such a connection specifically for this exhibition to the Eastern State Penitentiary? Like, what was it that you felt instantly attracted to, do you think?
So for me, I had rented out the penitentiary. What happened was I left RIT. I was teaching there for 2 years. And I went down to run the photo program at Mercer County Community College after my mentor, Lou Draper, passed away. And for 3 years, I did that while working on my MFA at University of the Arts. During the MFA, my bookbinding professor was Haiti Kyle, and she was the head conservator at the American Philosophical Society, which is part of Independence Hall. And one day we had a field trip, we walk in, and I had no interest in photographing the penitentiary before this moment. It was just another ruin to me. Like I said, we'd rent it out multiple times for students. They would get overwhelmed, wouldn't get any good photographs. Next time we go back in, I'd lock them into a certain area. And then they'd be like, why did I get better photos? Because you weren't overwhelmed by this, ruin.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I walked in to see Haiti Kyle, these log books were sitting there. There was 2 of them. And I just immediately went to them. I didn't even listen to what she said the rest of the class. I was probably that student. And because I was just pulled in. And what the warden wrote, like this particular one, Eliza Connolly, the prisoner, because Eastern State Penitentiary was solitary, it was male, female, it was every race. Whoever was writing this, there's a debate going on that we had spoken about previously about whether it was the warden or another person who actually wrote this. But you can tell this is some sort of an intake or some sort of interview. And so you know what race they are, how much they drank, what their religion is, how smart or dumb they were, as they would say oftentimes. So that's really what pulled me in, because all of a sudden then there was a voice for the place.
Right. So the warden's books and log books were the foundation for this entire exhibition. How extensive do you feel that the note keeping was? And were there any surprising stories that you found written in those log books?
I would say I'll start with the surprising part. The most surprising part was how direct it was, where sometimes you would read and hear "too stupid to live." Things just like that. Eliza Connolly, again, since we're on this still, she tried to poison the gentleman and lady with whom she lived. So it's giving their story. So you know why they're in there. And really, if you know the history of Eastern State Penitentiary, it was the first penitentiary in the United States. And the reason was, before that, it was jails where, you throw 25 people in just to torture them, basically. This was the first attempt that you were handed a Bible, and you were basically, when you walked into your cell, the door was smaller, so you had to bow to God. You were in solitary. You were supposed to give penance. So that's where the word penitentiary even derives from. And that's why this voice, it really goes along with that whole idea of the Quaker belief of what they're in for, what's their education level, how much do they drink. You can really see the reflection in these log books about the religious aspect of it.
Right.
And that was one of the big things.
Did you feel like looking it through a lens such as the religious lens, did that kind of add another element, or did you feel like it kind of took away from maybe the more honest symptoms and what's the word, the prescriptions for these patients?
Really what it was for me was the idea that this was the first attempt. This was honestly, if you think about it, this was our first attempt and probably only attempt at prison reform in the United States, where we weren't doing things like they were doing in Europe, and hoping that they would reform and get out. So for me, it was more or less looking at it in that lens. And that's why, like, the marks, even on these pages, That was the big thing for me, was reflecting off of these when I would go in and photograph. As David Graham from University Art said, when he heard what I was doing, he goes, come on, man, you can't make any original photographs. There's too many tripod holes. Because they would take their students there also.
Right.
And you get so overwhelmed that everybody takes the same photographs when they go to Eastern State Penitentiary. That's why I went so many times over and over. But really what helped me was these books were falling apart. So Haiti Kyle and I made an agreement. I would go in and I think it was 7 or 8 books. I photographed every page of every book.
Oh, cool.
And by having every page of every book, I was able to read 4 to 6 pages before I would go in and photograph each time. And I think what really that helped me to have a different mindset of what I was looking for each time I photographed. In fact, we'll get to later on, there will be a photograph. The title, Thou Art Will Give, was one day I was reading about 4 pages of prisoners that either all went insane or died in the penitentiary. And so I was really feeling very disheartened. And I was in the chaplain's office and I turned around to leave and there's mosaics up on the wall. And it was the start of a prayer with 2 lines. And on it, in a little while, you'll see Thou Art was the first line, the start of it. And the second line was Will Give.
Yeah.
And I was just like, these prisoners gave everything being in here. And that's where even the title came from, a reaction to what was happening. And here's where you can see, since we were talking about before, on the bottom left here, you see not much hope.
Right.
With this particular prisoner.
Yeah. So when you were on location shooting for this exhibition, and you had like these logbook annotations in your mind, like you said, a lot of people oftentimes get overwhelmed with just the atmosphere of the space itself. But when you came in with a whole new lens, with the background knowledge of different people's lives and reasons for being in this place, what do you feel like you were seeing differently, or what more were you seeing or less that you were overwhelmed with?
I think it really goes back to the idea that I wasn't really looking at the space. I was really and truly reflecting off of what I read and had that voice in my head each and every day. And I would also take those pages with me, because certain days I was there for, 8 hours or so. In the middle of the winter, I'd be the only person in there. So I could go back and look at some more of the details, just like I was looking at details of the penitentiary. And I never went back to pages because, number one, there were so many, but also just that reflection for the day. And I think being armed with that, and a lot of what I was doing with the photographs is a lot of it, because there's not much light in there, is painting with light. So I have big flashlights and I'm really filling in the light. So when I find the space, I'm also putting the emotion on how I'm lighting it into the photograph. And that's why these are all filmed for long exposures. Most of them are between 5 to 15-minute long exposures. There is Photoshop work that's done after also, because sometimes I overpainted. But that's what really, for me, I think helps separate it to be a little bit different.
Yeah. When you were on site and you were, of course, going into, like you said, you were going and visiting places that not a lot of people had either the time or the mind space to go and explore. Were there any remnants of any of the inhabitants left that you discovered on site?
Absolutely. When they actually closed it in 1972, they basically vacated everything. So here's actually, to give you an idea, a good old bed frame. But there were bottles of pills left. There was just about anything and everything you can imagine. When they went back in, so what was going to happen is they closed in 1972, 71, in that area. When they went back in 1994, they were about to tear it down to make condos in Philadelphia. And somebody said, wait a minute, this had plumbing and heat before the White House did. This is probably pretty significant. So it was declared a ruin. So now it's a museum, and they also have many of the artifacts. But here's an idea of the mosaics that were even there. Some of them are fallen down. But with that, from pills to, the beds to just about everything, it was almost as if they just left it and vacated it. So there are many, many items in there. And many of them have been removed because people just going in and stealing stuff. But
Really? They're still allowed to do that?
Oh yeah, well, it was, I could only imagine what was happening in here between 72 and 94. I can almost see this being like one big party, expecting like raves or something to be going on in there.
Yeah.
But some of the things that are left over, so part of Eastern State Penitentiary now being a museum, they do a lot of site-specific installations. So in 1994, when they went back in, there was a family of, I believe, 32 cats living there. So
Wow.
an artist, they do a lot of site-specific installations. Well, this particular artist made 32 called ghost cats and put them throughout the penitentiary. So as you were going on the tour, the kids had something to look for, and the adults, of course, too. But here's where you see one of the benches that was a remnant, and you can only imagine somebody sitting here, the chaplain gazing out the window with a sense of no hope in many ways.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes coming across that also helps. The feeling too, a bed in the infirmary with it just being rusted, just the feeling of, for me, of death and hopelessness again, that particular day.
Mhm.
So that's really what we see for remnant wise.
Yeah. I remember one of my favorite pieces, speaking of remnants, was the chalkboard, the one where, it was very obviously, like you said, haphazardly like erased, but you could still view some of the letters that were on there from, like, God knows how old, like, those words were written down and now are still there. That was something that I was struck by when I unwrapped all of your work and finally got to see it in person for myself. Um, and speaking of which, when I received the work, and we talked about this, of course, before the installation even arrived, was there a deliberate choice in having the pieces exposed? Right now, they're just hanging by magnets in the gallery space. I noticed too that a lot of your other works, you like to prep them the exact same way. Is there any deliberate reason for that?
So it's really, this series is prepared in two ways. One with traditional black frames with window mats, which looks very formal. They look like a specimen on the wall, a photograph. Where with the earth magnets, I really feel like you're more in the environment where you can walk into it. And I did this at the first time I ever showed it as my thesis, where I put wooden strips behind the pieces and put it on the wall that way. And that was really where I liked it. Unfortunately, some galleries require frames, so I can't do it that way with the earth magnet. But for me, it's about allowing the viewer, not having that frame, not allowing it to feel like a photograph on the wall, but rather something you can walk into.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things that I truly like about that. And really, the idea of the selection that I sent was, I didn't want to overwhelm you with the amount of space that you had, but I wanted to allow you, because one of my favorite parts about showing this now, I think there's been about 20 solo shows with it, is allowing the curator to have fun and make your narrative. So my question to you, which you didn't know I was going to say, is, as you were hanging it and sequencing, what did you feel as the curator hanging it, and what narration did you place on the walls?
So if you actually go and visit the Foundry Art Center's Ameristar Gallery, you'll see all the selections that I particularly picked from what you had sent to me. Because we don't post anything that's not actually on the walls as a rule. But when I looked over all of the pieces, the biggest thing that I noticed and I wanted to capture was, well, for one thing, it's photography. So the biggest thing that I am looking for is light and how the light is directing the viewer's eye and focus. And the second thing was, like, I guess, a sense of space and a sense of, like you said, like that you were in the atmosphere, that you were, fully immersed in this area. A lot of the pieces I made sure, there's the chalkboard, I made sure had a lot of deep contrast, that you could see all the grit and the grime that were on the walls, on the bed frames, anywhere. And I loved on how that grittiness was in almost stark contrast to how, like, light would filter in through the windows, how, you know, both menacing and yet inviting some of the pieces were. One of my favorites is the warden's corridor. It's essentially this very long, it's very simple. All it is just a simple window on one side that you can't really see because it's a embossed window, and then just the hallway itself, and then there's a door and a staircase leading up elsewhere. But it was the simple way that it was framed and photographed that really made me feel that kind of vertigo moment where I felt as though I was standing in that hallway and it was expanding and like looming over me in a sense. So mainly when I looked at the work, that was something that I gravitated toward, was you whenever you focused on the little details, and yet when you focused on the bigger picture and the bigger atmosphere of the space. Because I felt as though the viewers would really love and enjoy that play of micro and macro of how does this space feel versus how does it interact with me in the space. Of course we can't we can't just, you know, evaporate ourselves into the penitentiary and back again, but the work I feel like is so strong that it was well enough to do for, and especially with the warden's logbooks, like we both mentioned on how they had to be there just so that way people would get a chance to, you know, get some context and historical, you know, almost reverence for a space that was kind of both, like you said, hopeful and yet detrimental to a lot of people's lives. So having seen like in this logbook where it says died in July, like, I mean, even though that it's written in such a beautifully calligraphed way, and it makes you feel as though, and the fact that it's a logbook makes you feel as though it's just a series of numbers and skills. Um, it really, though, points out the context of you're not just in a space that is a ruin, but you're in a space that is a ruin of people who did live here and who did try to improve their lives in one way or another, and who some may have succeeded and some that very obviously couldn't. So yeah, I thought that the exhibition was a great balance between, you know, actually feeling the exhibition and then feeling the context of the exhibition in the space of the penitentiary. So
So it sounds like you were having a play of pulling people in, pushing them back out of spaces.
yeah.
So now I wish I could see it.
Yeah, I know. Well, you can still view it, of course, online, but I mean, it always is nothing compared to actually viewing it in person.
And we are going to put some installation shots on my website so we can actually all judge your sequencing and, you know, your hanging. All right.
Yeah.
Those will be on the website afterwards.
Yeah.
But this is actually showing you some of the previous installation shots from when I finished this series in 2014. For me, it was, I knew I had 4 galleries. It's the Dyer Art Center at NTID, National Technical Institute for Deaf at RIT. So I gave myself a personal deadline. So here's just showing, I've never shown these outside of this particular space, but the warden's logbooks in gum bichromate prints, which is a printmaking process using UV light, but CMYK, and they're not always perfect because I want to bring that emotion out in a different way also. But this is just showing what you talked about, the earth magnets.
Mm-hmm.
For people watching this video, you can see where there's no frame. Hopefully you're able to enter the pieces. So that's why I want to get to this one for you.
Yeah.
So, and then the traditional framed.
Mm-hmm.
So this is actually perfect sequencing to follow up your question, where you see where they're very formal. I feel that do not invite you in because there's that black frame.
Well, I feel like it's both the frame. It's pretty much always the glass too, if there's any plexiglass or glass in between the work. And then the matting. The matting makes a huge difference when it comes to, especially for pieces that are meant to be more spatial and aware. It helps a lot for more of the micro pieces that are meant to make you focus in on the details. But when it's meant to, like you said, fully immerse yourself in, I feel like the matting and, like you said, the frame really do make a difference, because this is a totally different vibe than just having the earth magnets and having almost the pieces. Like I saw the one show, they had them almost like bare bones next to each other. There was no space in between one piece to the next, which is completely different than here, where they very clearly have a uniform. It's all perfectly laid out. Yeah, just like this, where it was very little in between, where you could and on top of that, this installation showcases that pieces were compared. You had 2 pieces right next to side by side for you to look at one and then immediately look at the other, which is very interesting. I love installation shots, and movable walls like this really prove how an installation can be completely different between galleries, which is amazing.
Absolutely.
Um,
one of your other questions, you haven't asked it yet, but since we're on this slide, you had asked about the inhabitants and things like that. I was in there 362 times. We've talked about this. And I was there at night with ghost hunters, you know, all the ghost hunters from this channel, that channel. They would bring in millions of dollars worth of equipment. There's other fun stories with that, but I was in there in the winter by myself and I wanted to see something. And unfortunately, I never saw anything. And the only thing that ever came out on my film, this is a comparison of these two. These are two different frames.
Ooh.
So if you look in the middle, there's something moving through the frame.
Yeah.
And this wasn't until years later. So
yeah, and that wasn't one of like the camera crew or anyone else that was in the building at that time, right?
no, the camera crews, they were only there ever at night.
Oh, so this is day shot.
Yeah, this is a day shot. So this is probably only, you know, I have low depth of field. So I'm guessing this was maybe probably a 15-second exposure at most that would have occurred. And I was typically there a lot by myself during the winter, and other times I didn't want to be around people because what I was doing, because then everybody's like, oh, you're photographing, you want to have a conversation, where I went on the days it was always closed. And if it was there when it wasn't closed, I would go into the spaces that I was allowed to go in where the public couldn't go. Eastern State Penitentiary was very good to me. They'd give me a walkie-talkie in case I fell through any floors. Oops. But that's, so yeah, no, and it looks like then whatever it is might be, sorry, I'm horrible at going back and forth, in the back right corner behind the stairs in the second
Right.
shot. I apologize for this.
That's okay.
So I have no idea. That was the only thing. And what I was doing was, because I'd never shown this before, only at the Dyer Art Center did I ever do that. And I put a GoPro up just to see what people would be doing. And I put like the contact sheet up to show the sequence, because oftentimes I would shoot the same scene, maybe slightly different as to why. So I just want to see what people's reactions were. So. Yeah,
and I noticed for this one, it was pretty much the same hallway, just on either side. One with was it like a name tag or something like that? And then the other side where it's just the focus on the light fixtures.
Yeah, it was almost kind of the same. It was just same angle. So I'm curious, did you hang this one up next to each other?
I didn't. I actually debated for the longest time if I ought to. I was really trying to be diverse when picking the pieces. So I picked the one where the focus was on the light.
Okay.
And I wanted to, because I loved this angle. I loved the fact that this is an image that reminds me of being a little kid, you know, being, you know, at the low angle looking upwards, trying to like look for someone or something that might help you. And though I was really intrigued by the side with the name tag, I was struggling whether or not to put these two side by side, but there was no wall for me to do it. I just loved the fact that both pieces, again, showcase like the wallpaper coming down off the walls, or the paint, I guess it is, and the piping that was like really drawing your eye directly to the hallway. That was, to me, my favorite part about these two pieces. But I did struggle. I struggled a lot with whether or not to put them side by side, or even just across the way, to see if people would recognize that it was pretty much the same hallway or not. But I ended up not doing it because of the wall space restrictions.
That's why it's the fun part for me, just not giving you any instruction, just letting you have fun. So
yeah,
it's interesting what different voices.
Right. So I have another question then. Have you visited any other penitentiaries besides Eastern State to compare and contrast, or to do another shoot or anything of that matter? Or have none of them connected as well to you?
None.
Yeah.
Not a single one. And I really go back to the idea for me was that without the warden's logbooks, I was in there, I think 4 or 5, maybe 6 times with my students from Mercer County, where we would rent it out for Mondays. And I didn't pick up the camera once. And the reason is because it was just one of those peeling paint ruins that everybody loves to go photograph for no reason other than it being peeling paint. And so for me, that's why I have not. And what's interesting is my wife grew up in Auburn, New York, which has the New York State system that rivaled the Eastern State Penitentiary system. They were both solitaire.
Mhm.
Pennsylvania system was they were solitaire all day and all night. The New York system, they got out during the day to work in silence, but then they went back into their cells for solitaire back in the 1800s. And my wife's uncle works there teaching English to people. He's like, you want to come and photograph there too? I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm fine. So, and that's where people are like, oh, you're a prison photographer. I'm like, no, now I'm a paper photographer. It's like, no,
Now you're pigeonholed. Yeah.
I keep being pigeonholed by my different projects. So it's
Mhm.
pretty interesting. And really, it goes back to the idea. This is a perfect example that you asked this question without the warden's logbooks, because then I started working with text and imagery. So it's taking the text off the pages and placing it into the space to give more of that story, which became important to me. I tried multiple ways of doing this. I was taking projectors into the penitentiary, projecting the books on the walls. It just wasn't working. I was working with a graphic design professor for my thesis committee, Lawrence Bach. And he's like, you know what? He gave different exercises, and it really became down to it where I just worked with Photoshop, removed the page, and started to have the control to put the text, text and imagery where I wanted it to be.
Mhm.
So, and that's where, if this one's very, another important one, very ignorant, most deeply hardened. I mean,
Yeah.
that says everything about this person that we really need to have. So that's
And do
why I
you
haven't gone other places.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And do you know how many, because you said that there's at least 8 logbooks, right? Do you have any number of people that you have read upon to like see their fates or anything like that? Or do you know the estimate about how many people actually like lived and worked and breathed in the penitentiary?
No, that's something I don't have. I'm sure that that's on the Eastern State Penitentiary's website. I'm sure of that. For me, at the time, it was really reflecting off these pages. And I probably averaged what, 5? Because I was going between 4 and 6. It was always that even number. So if I say 5 and 362 times, so I probably read what, 1,800 pages from the log books before I would go and photograph. But yeah, no, it's that part of like the modern counts and things like that. I don't have that part of the history.
I just didn't know if you knew how many like prisoners you actually read upon, or if you.
Probably about 1,700, I would assume.
Mhm.
So, because it was always grouped up in clusters. I shouldn't say that.
Right.
That's actually pages. So typically there was 2 on every page. I'm forgetting that aspect of it.
Mhm.
So probably close to over 3,000 prisoners. But they were grouped, unfortunately, according to those pages. So that's why I never thought of them as um, prisoners. It was always whatever those 4 to 6 pages were providing me at the time. And of course, there were dominant, prisoners from those 4 pages that controlled more of what I was feeling, I'm sure.
Right.
But yeah, it was really more or less that.
Yeah, it is kind of dizzying though to think about the fact that, at the very minimum, 2 people shared a single paragraph about an entire description of both their life, their crimes, and their fate, essentially, all on one page. And that, and to think about like how a life can be reduced to a single, 4 to 5 sentences about them, and then a single, X through it to check them off a list is just again dizzying to imagine that, and especially since it kind of gives an insight as to the life at the penitentiary. You would imagine then that if they said that, that they were an impotent or stupid or something like that, then you recognize that the warden himself or whoever is writing in these logbooks has already, crossed them off as, someone to, not really care too much about or not to give as much effort into. So I don't know, was that anything that was crossing through your mind when you were going through it?
Especially when you saw at times like, oh, such and such is back was also a number such and such from before. It's about a number, it's not, oh,
Right.
came in on this date previously. Oh, look at log entry, a return. And as you said, it was sometimes, narrowing it down to so simple, those 5 classifications: race, religion, smarts, more or less, how much they drank, and then what they were in for. And that's really that all is being covered. So it's like those 5 things are the most important things about this person's life. So yeah, no, I agree 100% with you. And that's why it was so interesting to see sometimes the tone would come across just like you can tell almost like you were in the interview, like they were not getting along at all.
Right.
Type of thing where very ignorant. It's just like, all right, well, what was he saying? And then sometimes you saw that the person wrote that the devil has taken over their soul. It's like, what were they doing in this interview that they deemed that the devil has taken over their soul?
They were possessed.
I mean, there's something.
Yeah. And these logbooks, were they just a personal, record keeping for the penitentiary themselves, or were these logbooks that they had to deliver to and report back in on to another higher up or anything like that? Were there any? No, go ahead.
I would say that's something I don't know of. I'm sure that they did for some reason, because remember, it was an experiment at the time. So they had to prove whether the system was working. And then eventually it was deemed that it wasn't, because people were going insane or dying or not being reformed and coming back in. So it became what we know of as penitentiaries today, where there's 2-3 people in a cell block or a cell at a time. So, I mean, the experiment ultimately failed. And then, it became what we know of as today. And really, it hasn't changed since then. What have we done for prison reform? And that's one of the big things that's going on today. So
yeah, it is very obviously a prevalent issue that has, been a part of humanity since, the dawn of civilization. Just as a side note, were there any fun, I know that, again, like you said, it's based the very basics of every person that ever had to be written down in these logbooks. Were there any notes that were taken along the side from the wardens about themselves or any of the other bookkeepers or jailhousemen that were there that actually had to monitor these people, or was it only about the inmates themselves?
It was really about the inmates. Because again, you asked the question earlier about research. I started buying court records from Pennsylvania from this time off of eBay. So I would have some of those logs, see what happened in the trials, but I wound up with more divorce and everything else. But the biggest thing that I learned was we think about crime as being more modern. Like we think rape, people being up, all these different things are more modern, or even, being conned. No, all this was happening in the 1800s, the 1900s. And that's really the biggest thing that it was kind of like, wait a minute, there's nothing new happening today. Yeah, we have computer crimes, but the base was still happening back in the 1800s.
Right.
It's something that we don't think about. And that's where, how can you say that there's no hope of this man? That's where the warden, the third from the bottom line to the right is no hope of this man. So it's that part to it. And really the idea overall that, man, things have not changed at all, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's kind of depressing in a way if you think about it too long.
Absolutely.
But at the very least, I viewed these images as, even though that they were depressing to imagine people living their lives in these small corners and being either forgotten or treated horribly or however they live, it was good to know that this place itself, though, is a ruin. This is very obviously a place that, we tried an idea and it did not work, and we have abandoned it because of that. And though, like you said, police reform and the prison system and all that stuff is still an archaic system that still needs a little bit of tweaking here and there, a lot of tweaking for some people. It's good to know, though, that places like these have been, in their own way, marked off as this was an idea and it will only stay an idea from this point on. Of course, we still have the prison system, and of course, we still have asylum and all these other places like that for people to visit. But I wonder and hope that people who do read these logs, that do visit the penitentiary and stuff, view it as something that is a mark on history, but not as a definer of our history, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's why exactly what you said is what the people that take care of Eastern State Penitentiary have really changed their mission over the last 10 years, which is to bring awareness to help people understand what we did in the past. And most of their programming now is about what are we fighting now with prison reform. So they have the past, but they're looking to the future as well, just as much, which is really nice to see, saying we have this here for the history. How can we possibly help shape the future? Which I think is really powerful for any museum to be able to do. Oftentimes we, you know, as the artists, we try to show, but how do we bring more to like the programming? Like we're doing this to hopefully bring more awareness to why those photos are on the wall. Well, Eastern State Penitentiary doing what they're doing now with focusing on how do we help, you know, minorities and what's going on with the police. So they are really trying to focus on, you know, the future. So
Right. And you even said so, I don't remember if we said this before we started recording or not, but you even said so that you recognize the fact that you are an artist who is a male white artist, you know, documenting all of these different lifestyles and stuff like that, that very clearly had a different lifestyle than you. Do you find that to be not in conflict, but do you find that to be somewhat of an interest for whenever either people go up and view the work or when you yourself are reflecting on the work itself that you're viewing?
for me, I think that's where all of my work that I do, and that's where the idea of the documentary style is really trying to research and be aware of, you know, the privilege that I do have, number one, but number two, what am I seeing that is a problem and understanding that. And I really take almost all this back to my mentor, who was Lou Draper. Lou was, you know, he's black. He's part of Kumonji. He started that with Roy de Carava, and there was many infamous photographers. In fact, there's a exhibition that just traveled from Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to the Whitney, and then it's going somewhere in the Midwest, of Lou Draper and Kumonji. I mean, these guys were infamous through the civil rights movement in Harlem and many other places, photographing. And a lot of what Lou had instilled in me was, you know, why are you doing it? What's the reason behind it? What are you trying to demonstrate to the viewer? And do you actually understand what you're trying to do? Like just those three key things. I mean, there's much more depth to it, but I think that's where I'll go back to, even though it's not here, the payphone work. You know, when I moved into this neighborhood, the reason why that body started was a lot of my colleagues at RIT were labeling this area as being a war zone and, you know, all this stuff, and it's not safe. Meanwhile, the first truck I backed up, 3 9-year-olds came over and helped me start moving stuff in. Harry, Elijah, and Grumpy. And if it wasn't for those 3 kids, you know, I know all the neighbors, it's a true community. And that's the only way to put it is it pissed me off so much that's where I started looking at why are people labeling these people?
Right.
And because me being a white male, I had to look at that more as saying, well, why are my colleagues who primarily are white male or females, it was more the males, I will say that right now, labeling this area. And so by taking that step out of the scene and kind of looking in, trying to figure it out, I think has really helped me with my photography personally. And that's where, again, I think that's why when you asked if I've gone to other prisons, nope, because I was able to step out and look at the voice with those warden's logbooks for this particular series. So it's a long answer, but I struggle with that. But my wife also works in the Rochester City School District, which unfortunately is the worst school district in all of New York State. And so by going to her school, meeting the kids, you know, meeting the other teachers, just seeing what these kids are going through, I think has also shaped a lot of my life and my photography to understand what my kids have. And as a parent, just like my photography, I try to bring my kids play with the neighborhood kids, which are completely different than his friends where we live in the suburbs. But it's also made him start to be able to think about, you know, I don't play with this anymore. Do you mind if I give it to Harry? No, feel free. So hopefully we're raising our kids to be aware of what they have and what others don't also. So that's why I really say my photography is my life, just like my life is, you know, there is no boundaries with that. So.
Yeah. And have you had any kind of backlash or anything like that, specifically to either this or any of your other work, speaking out and about the disenfranchised side of life?
No, I wouldn't say I really had any backlash from anybody about it, but the current work, the payphone work, I'm making sure that once I start exhibiting it, because this is still a big work in progress, It's been in magazines and some other exhibitions, but I'm also photographing the payphones in other cities when I travel, ironically, for this series as a solo show, because I want to say, look, Rochester is not the only place that still has them. New Orleans, Portland, Tucson has an abundance of them, and people are using them still because of the poverty level.
Right.
So I'm trying to make sure I'm also at the same time saying, hey, look, Rochester's not the only one. I'm not putting down Rochester, because we had an issue when the Magnum photographers came into town a few years ago, and then an article was run in New York Times. So again, just trying to be aware of that, with that in the back of my mind. So I'm not just putting down the city I live in. So
Yeah. So as like one of the final questions, was there any favorite of specifically the Eastern Penitentiary work that you did? Was there any that really you were just like either super proud of or thought that really conveyed what what you wanted for this show to be?
I was just looking up because I was trying to, right above me, I have 5 of my pieces that are on the wall. One, because it's garnered so many awards, is the drapery. But one of my personal favorites is called Entrance into the Infirmary, where it's the 2 doors. And I just remember painting that with light and just really enjoying that moment for some reason. Just going through these last few, because then what I'm going to do, oh, this is real quick. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera around so you can see what obviously my 5 favorites would have to be, because they're the only that are here. Also, one of my favorites with the text and imagery, the Samuel Johnson, which is when I was looking up and just placed the text over imagery. The Warden's Corridor that you talked about is up there. And the one that can be seen as a diptych, but I have the X-ray up there.
Cool.
So Eastern State also does a Terror Behind the Walls, which is their haunted penitentiary. And that helps to raise funds. I had never been through there except one day when I was in there by myself in the middle of winter. And I was walking through, and apparently they forgot to turn off some of the motion sensors, so stuff starts flying out at me. But I came across this scene, and I thought it was perfect because this is right when I was coming to the end of the project, or towards the end, like last 5 months, I think. And it just felt like, because I put so much time into reading and everything else, that this was my my self-portrait after finishing this project of sorts.
You identified with the skeleton and ball and chain and everything.
All of it. So what I'm going to do real quick, hopefully it doesn't, just to answer. Of course, now everything's yelling at me because I disconnected without ejecting hard drives. Come on.
It's okay. We can still hear you.
All right. Actually, I should stop the share. So these are actually my pieces: the Samuel, the Warden's Corridor, the drapery. So those would be my pieces.
Gotcha.
Further there, so I might as well show it.
I'm surprised that was it God's Eye? That was another favorite of mine, where it was just like the up look of the window and stuff like that. That was another one that I really enjoyed. That you caught. I'm surprised that one and the cafeteria wasn't up there. Those two were really cool to see, for me at least.
Yeah, no, different. It's all different.
Yeah. So we're done. Is there anything that you want to talk about for future plans, or anything else that you'd like to plug to let everyone know about what your upcoming plans are?
Well, I would really like to thank you for taking the time in the middle of COVID and everything to have this, move forward, because, every week it's changing for all of us. So thank you for being consistent with this and everything that's been happening, and for taking the time to do this. The only thing that's happening with this body of work in the future, let me grab this also, is the Rhode Island Center for Photography. That was one of the exhibitions that was postponed rather than canceled for this. But I'm just looking forward to, in the next few months, I am trying to work on a monograph for this particular book. Funds were saved. Luckily, funds were saved before COVID hit, because my studio, it's at 20% of normal capacity. So the studio has been able to live off of the funds that were meant to be for the book for the penitentiary. There is lens work, which is out, which I believe they're still selling copies of this, which actually, the barber's chair, which is another favorite for people, as you see, it made the front cover. But really for the future, for me, this was supposed to be printed at the Borowski Center at University of the Arts. It never came about. And that was the agreement with Eastern State Penitentiary, was that they would be able to sell the book in their gift shop to help raise some funds.
Right.
So hopefully in the future, now that the funds have been depleted, hopefully in the next year or two, can actually get that out. All the writing's done with introductions and forwards. So, and the installation shots will be on my website, so you can see how well Kaitlin did everybody.
Thanks.
In the future.
Yeah, I'm sure though, as both a photographer and a book artist, I'm sure you're like over the moon with the possibility of having that, be archived and actually put together in like a full body of work for the penitentiary, which is even better.
For me, it's really about fulfilling my obligation to them, because certain things didn't happen before, and that's one area where I feel really bad about.
Yeah.
So it's truly about, I need to fulfill my part of it. They were really good to me. So
Good. Yeah. It is great to give a little back. So
try to.
no, but I thank you for being such a wonderful and understanding artist, especially like you said, with all the COVID stuff that has been happening since you got the notification that you won the award for emerging artists. And we at the Foundry thank you very much for all of your wonderful artwork and having us allow the public to come and view the space and see your work and talk more about like some very important issues that your work brings up. So we're very grateful to have you on, and I hope that maybe sometime in the future we'll get to work with you again.
Sounds good.
Yeah.